Welcome back to the Crimson Chat, where KU's most compelling voices share their stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jaden Hill, and today we're joined by Paul Scott, professor of French at the University of Kansas, affiliate of the Gunn Center for the Center of Science Fiction, and associate member of the Center for East Asian Studies. Professor Scott's research spans centuries and genres, from subversions during the Ancien regime to the radical potential of science fiction. He's currently working on a book about the evolution of the rational zombie in global television, and his teaching bridges early modern French speculative fiction and cultural critique. Professor Scott, welcome.
Pleased to be here.
Professor Scott, welcome to the Crimson Chat.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to dive into your research, but before we get there, I want to learn a little bit about your background. So what first drew you to literature and French? Because you're originally from the UK, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Well, you know, I've always been drawn to literature. I had some inspiring teachers, one of whom in high school had been Tolkien student at Oxford, so he had all these stories about meeting Tolkien once a week. And to have that direct connection to somebody I was reading was just, I think it motivated me. With the French, it's a very indirect way I got to French literature because at 18 I went to live in France with no French. And I lived there for 3 years at that point. And it was because from about the age of 13 and 14, I wanted to be a Catholic priest. And so I joined a religious order. The closest seminary was in France, and so I ended up going to France. After 3 years, I realized that this, wasn't for me, and I came back to the UK. And the big question was, I'm going to go to university. What should I do? And I decided, probably not anything to do with theology. And then I thought, well, I liked literature and I liked French, so I ended up doing a modern language degree. So
That's exciting. And you've taught and studied both in the US, UK, and France. How does that shape your academic journey and even what you research now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a big advocate for study abroad because I think one of the things about going overseas, about learning a different language and culture is you go somewhere and it's a big challenge, and often you're using a language unless you go to an English-speaking country. But at the end of the day, you don't only learn about your host culture, you actually learn about yourself and what your values are, what your identity is. So it's a journey of self-discovery as well as discovering things outside of yourself.
Is there a piece of literature or possibly some sort of show or movie that has stuck with you throughout your career that's maybe shaped, especially your work in the speculative fiction area?
Well, there are two things I'd say that stand out to me. And the first is it's a poem by T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. It's an epic poem. We studied it at school when I was 16, and we pretty much spent a whole term on it. And my teacher, Mr. Alston, he told us, this is a poem that's you probably hate it at first, which I absolutely did. I loathed it at first. But he said, because it covers everything, humanity, the meaning of life, what is civilization, what is it to be human. He said it has the power to kind of haunt you through your life, and it's turned out to be the case. I actually wrote to him last year, and I said, I don't know if you remember me, but you said this 40-something years ago, and I just wanted to say you're right, it's absolutely been the case. So I reread it every year. And a lot of the works that The Wasteland references over the years I've actually got to know just because of The Wasteland. In terms of science fiction, I would say my favorite work in science fiction, it's a movie called Gattaca, came out in 1997. Gattaca is it's a movie set in the near future. It's about a world in which there's genetic manipulation. What I love about the movie is that it's just a perfect piece of work. It's one of those films where it's perfect acting. The soundtrack is fantastic. The cinematography is just beautiful. It looks fresh today, and it's a work of science fiction that actually changed legislation. It led to 2008 Act of to protect people against genetic manipulation, their data being misused. I finally got to teach it in 2023 because I was teaching a University Scholar Seminar, and I've actually now, since that class and that experience of teaching it and students' responses to it, I've now incorporated it into my first year seminar in subversive science fiction.
It's really cool to see how this work has shaped all the different sides of your work, and you're very interdisciplinary, which is really exciting. And speaking of that, you've taught French since 2004 at the University of Kansas. Mm-hmm. Why is learning another language not just important for the practical use of speaking it, but really for the student to expand on themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are so many reasons why learning a language makes real concrete sense, and it's not just that you're expanding your knowledge. It's not just that it's an academic discipline, which it really is, but also you can't divorce the language from the cultures that speak it. So your process of learning a language is going to necessarily involve learning about different cultures, different countries, and their history. And I think a great example is in French. We talk about, you go shopping and you're in a mall and you're looking in shop windows and you're window shopping. But the French call it faire la lèche vitrine, which literally means window licking. And I love this sense of this encapsulation of consumerism that, shop windows are essentially advertisements, and they're trying to lure you to buy things that, essentially often you don't actually need. So in the French term, there is a kind of judgment of the whole process. I've been learning Korean for the past 2 years as for that discipline, that mental acuity, but also because I work in Korean science fiction. I wanted to have the language so that I didn't, miss some of the nuances. There's a word that I really love in Korean. It's bae, and bae means ship, it means pen, it means stomach, and it's the shape. It's this shape that has come into those three things, and I just think that's beautiful.
That's so exciting. I mean, just of how you're continuing to learn different languages and also just how it's shaped the stuff that you're doing. But I'm curious, a lot of people feel like once you hit college age, it's too late. I know even in the education sector, because that's partly what I'm in, that people are like, okay, you should really learn languages when you're a young child. It goes much easier. You're able to actually fully learn it. You're not always translating in your head. Do you feel like you can still learn languages at your age, my age, at any age?
Yeah, well, I'm not dead yet, and the thing about languages is, I think in the past few years, the current wisdom has changed on it, and it used to be that it's going to be very hard as you get older, but the recent research is actually suggesting that the opposite is true. That in fact, you're equipped with the skills that you need to learn a language. So, Korean's my 7th language that I've learned formally. And I know the process. I'm at a point now after 2 years where I have to get over the psychological barrier of speaking. So I have 2 tutors. One is a TA here from whom I learn formal grammar twice a week, for 2 hours a week. And I have a conversation partner in Preply who is actually Korean, who lives in Seoul. So it's really good for me to do those 2 things. I think the problem comes, it's the vocabulary. So I think that by the time you get to to my age in life, there's so much mental accumulation that learning vocabulary can be a challenge, because I've already got lots of vocabulary in English and French and other languages. But this is not an unsurmountable hurdle. It's just something that you compartmentalize and that you manage. So, yeah.
So you mentioned you have a process. What is your process to learning a language?
So the process to learning the language, I think, is to actually practice it every day. So even if it's 10 minutes with flashcards doing a vocab, just that bare minimum every day, because that will actually, it'll increase your vocabulary range, and it will also, I think, it's a psychological thing about doing it every day, because you feel even if it's a small thing, you've done it. It's a little like writing. If you've got an assignment or a paper or something that you're working on, if you leave it for a while and you come back to it, you're obviously going to feel, oh goodness, this is still weighing on me. But if you even do a few words, and my book project yesterday, I actually went into the introduction, and I added a paragraph, and it felt good. It was only 30 minutes work, but it's, I felt like the book is a little bit closer, maybe a small way closer, but it's that little bit closer now than it was to completion. So.
I think that's great advice for anything that somebody is wanting to do, like you said, whether it be an assignment or a book or learning a language, but just some part of every day, having that be a part of what you do, it just gives you that internal confidence kind of in yourself.
Yep.
And it's interesting, we had a guest last semester and they talked about how one of the worst things you can do when you're trying to learn something is to lie to yourself about it. So if you say, I'm going to do this assignment at 3, for example, and then you don't do it at 3, you just start to distrust yourself and your confidence in what you can do. And so there's like a cyclical thing where you then start to do less work because you feel like you can't do the work, and that's a whole thing. So it's interesting that you have that same philosophy of if you do it every day, and if you say you're going to do it, make sure that you do it.
And it took a long time to get here. I've been a procrastinator, and you suffer. You just suffer. Yeah.
It's true. And you've also taught courses in Molière and fairy tales and French spectacle. What's one moment from the 17th century literature that really felt surprisingly modern? Before we got on and we're videoing, we were talking about how history really repeats itself. Is there something in that time period that you feel like, wow, it's like looking in a mirror?
So the 17th century, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, called it the first truly modern century. And I think that's true because it's really the century in which nation states become a thing. Before then, you were peoples, and there wasn't this sense of, there is this, frontier that actually marks our country. And I think that sense of national identity led to a sense of personal identity. So I think the thing that strikes me about the 17th century is Louis XIV, the king. So he's definitely one of those people that, you'd like to have dinner with. He'd be a very entertaining person, I think. At the same time, he's definitely somebody that you would not want to fall into his bad graces. And I think what Louis XIV grasped was, he grasped the performativity of power. I think in a way which, very few people in history have. The Emperor Augustus was somebody else who fabricated his image. In the 20th century, Goebbels and Adolf Hitler is another example. We can think of examples, close to today. I think of President Trump, and I'm not, suggesting, I'm not naming President Trump with Hitler. I'm actually thinking about President Trump crafting his image in that lineage of, people who are absolutely aware of that power is a spectacle. And I think, Donald Trump actually is a very interesting case with this. I'm thinking of the assassination attempt on President Trump, when he actually had the composure to raise his fist in the air, and that's something that Louis XIV would have done. That's something that Emperor Augustus would have done. It's that absolute insight into a sense of history and a sense of performance and a sense of power that is just absolutely fascinating.
How do you help your students connect those maybe historical contexts to maybe contemporary questions of now, like, why did Donald Trump raise his arm or different stuff like that? How do you make that connection in the classroom?
It's actually, it sounds like a very hard connection, but in fact it's a perfectly easy connection, because people in the 17th century, they're the same as us. They had the same preoccupations. The technology and the clothing are different. But other than that, they are writing about the same things. It's like, how do you maintain friendships? Why is love so painful and so, transforming? Why are these countries our country's enemies? All of these big macro and micro things, they're exactly the same. So when you read letters and when you read works in the 17th century, language may be a little different, but it is the same human beings having the same concerns, setting them out in the same ways.
I think that's a really great way to look at it, and I think it's also helpful to hear in a lot of ways, and almost calming to be like, okay, everyone's always had these sorts of struggles or aspirations or hopes or fears. And speaking of, how you teach, is there a moment in the classroom that really keeps you going? You've been teaching a long time. Is there a specific moment that you can remember that really felt like, I love doing this and this is why?
Yeah, well, I think my teaching career has been a series of those moments, and there are ups and downs like in everything. But I would say that there's a moment that's happened quite a lot, and it is, when there's something that I've taught many times, and sometimes I've published on, and there will be new insights, things that I hadn't seen before. I just think that's wonderful, because when we read something, when we watch something, we're going into it with our own backgrounds and our own ideas and our own experiences. So it's only natural that you're going to have a different perspective. So I think being open to those new perspectives is just wonderful. And there have been times, I think at least in free articles, where I've actually acknowledged students by name. I like to joke with students that I love this idea so much that I'm going to use it and pass it off as my own. But I do try and acknowledge whenever I can.
And it's exciting to see, I'm sure, young minds be excited about the same things that you're excited about. Even when I teach and do other things, it's always fun when, a student and you can connect over something that you have shared interest in and you're, some shared passion. So I think that's always really fun as well. And to move over to more of your speculative fiction work, you're affiliated with the KU's Gunn Center of Science, the study of science fiction. What does speculative fiction offer that other genres don't?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think as human beings, we're always interested in categories. We're always interested in definitions. Whether it's in our relationships, whether it's in the things that matter to us. I think that science fiction, speculative studies, there are many definitions, but the one I like the most, I keep coming back to, and Chris McKittrick, science fiction writer, definitely underscores this one. It's that science fiction asks the next big question. So at the moment, of course, one of the big questions we're fleshing out is AI, and it's not only its potential dangers, but its potential. So that's the big question that has been actually dealt with in science fiction for close to 6 decades now. Robots, AI, all of this kind of technology. So I think it's good to have that conversation before the technology arrives. Same thing, for example, with First Contact, the idea that there may be life out there in the cosmos. We have thrashed out all the potential scenarios of meeting a species that is likely to be much more intelligent than us. How we will communicate. What about this? What about that? What about if they don't treat us, on their level and see us as a low species? Of course, with the First Contact, one of our greatest fears is that extraterrestrial life will be like us, colonizers, aggressive. This kind of history that we unfortunately do have. But they could be like the best of us, which the whole notion of compassion that runs throughout human history that we tends to be overshadowed by violence, but compassion, has seemed in history to win out. G.K. Chesterton, the British writer, he made the remark that, many times in history it looks like we've gone to the dogs, but the dogs have always perished. We always get through things. If we can get through the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, I think we can get through the challenge of AI.
And I love the way that science fiction and speculative fiction attacks, these issues or potential issues. We recently read Clara and the Sun, which I'm sure you've read, which is, crazy how it was written long enough ago and how it's just really projected something that could be happening in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes.
And how does your work, your book, which is Cognitive Cadavers, right?
It's a working title. The press doesn't like it, so it's probably going to be changed into something more prosaic.
So your book, what issue is it addressing, or potential issue is it addressing?
Yeah, so I've been fascinated by zombies for a while, and one thing I find interesting about zombies, it's really our oldest monster. The possibility of zombies is mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, several thousand years ago. What I also like about zombies is how they have changed over the years. Not just changed in the way that they operate, but also changed in their metaphoric meanings. So for example, in 1985, in Day of the Dead, one of George Romero's movie, and George Romero is basically the father of modern zombies. Zombies suddenly become contagious, which had never been before. Vampires were contagious, but zombies used to just, they'd either slaughter people or they'd eat people. but the whole idea of a zombie bite being contagious. And I think it's very interesting that it happens at that moment and it kind of sticks, because 1985, it's the height of the global AIDS pandemic. So obviously with zombies, it's responding to something that's going on in wider culture, cultural anxiety, and it's playing it out on screen.
And what patterns have you seen as you've looked at zombies across cultures? And you mentioned earlier that in Korea you've looked at some of the work there. Are there any patterns that you've seen emerge?
What I've seen is, so I'm interested in rational zombies. I'm actually interested in the zombies who are not mindless, aimless, who go around in hordes. I'm interested in zombies that have agency, zombies that think. And from about 2012, it's really fascinating. Across the world, quite independently of each other, you had all these zombie television shows, mainstream shows. So, for example, in South Korea in 2020, there's a show called Zombie Detective. It ran for one season. It's a masterpiece, and it's about a zombie who it's a solitary zombie. He takes on the identity of a detective who's deceased, and he is created by a medical disaster, medical spillage. And at the end, he comes into human society, and he has to, fake being a detective. And what his concerns are: how does he get money for rent? How does he manage to survive? How does he conform? And in the end, all of these capitalist concerns, they coincide with what it is to be human. And he concludes that what it is to be human is to actually, operate in this precarious society where you're just living from one day to the next. And he opts out and lives in the mountains and decides to catch, wild animals to survive and live out of society. So it's an example in Korea of a suspicion of capitalism, which you find in Squid Game. And for me, it's a perfect example of how zombies can be molded into specific cultures, and in Korea it's actually been molded into this environmentalist, anti-capitalist trope, which I think is just showing the diversity, the variety, and the sheer persistent exuberism of the zombie genre.
How do you take television and look at it through an academic lens? What is your steps for that? Is it different from looking at literature, or do you think it's the same, or are there different components to it?
Yes and no. It's different, and it is the same, because what you've got to remember with television movies is it's essentially a dramatized script. So the text exists, and it's simply it is a performance of that script. So, of course, as a performance, it brings in other things. One of which is that you have ready-made characters. You're not visualizing, your own characters. And I'm sure we've all had that experience of, there's a book or work that we've really loved, and when it comes to the movie or television scenario of it, we find that an actor just isn't going to do it for us. I've certainly had this with audiobooks. I'm a huge audiobook listener. What I found out now is that I have to do samples and actually, listen to the narrator, because I've had a couple of cases where I bought the book, blind, not having listened to the narrator, and I listened to, one session. It's like, no, it's not going to work. This narrator just is not going to do it for me. So I think that it's, you've got the performance, the cinematography, the soundtrack. It's a text that has all of these other things. So let's face it, it's going to be richer, but with the potential as well of actually not actually gelling with you, and it just not being for you. And we know this. We've had the experience of having a show that we really love. That could be anything from The Sopranos to Billions. And we introduce somebody that we care for and we respect their opinions, and didn't like it. Sorry, it's not working for us.
It's an interesting lens to look at it through. And to move a little bit more also to your research, you're in affiliation with a lot of different honor societies. How does being a part of those societies shape your research?
I would say with all of these societies that I'm a member of, both at KU and outside in international societies, it is the notion of networking, that you have this network of people who may have similar interests to you and they may have vastly different interests to you. The fact is that you can actually make contact with them and have an exchange of ideas. So I started off as an early modern scholar, and I still work in early modern, 17th century matters. And in the 17th century, you had all these different nations in Europe that were divided both politically and also religiously. But with the exchange of letters, letters, really the internet of the age, there was something that came into being, and it was called the Republic of Letters. Letters meaning not only physical letters, but letters meaning learning. And it was this idea that there is this identity in this kind of nationhood, this statehood to which we belong, that actually in some ways can be more important than our own national, racial, religious identity.
You speak to your work in the modern area. You're the editor of the year's work in modern language studies. Mm-hmm. What is your role as the editor, and what exactly is that publication?
So the year's work in modern language studies have been published since 1930, and it really, in different languages, it actually it has subsections, and there's a survey of scholarly work that's been produced in each language subsection every year. So, for example, in French and Occitan, which is a section I also edit, we have everything from early medieval French literature right through to contemporary French literature, French cinema, French speculative studies. At the same time, the journal has a special mission, which is to promote what the European Union calls endangered and minority languages. So, for example, there's a small island of the UK called the Isle of Man. There's a section on Manx. There's a section on Yiddish. And something that I've been working on for a few years, which I think is actually going to come to fruition quite soon. I'm meeting actually on Friday of this week. Faculty members of the Indigenous Studies at KU is a Native American section. So there would be different tribal languages and cultures represented there. So basically, it is a compendium, a resource to show what is happening in each different language groups and subsections within those groups.
It's really amazing, and I appreciate how your work is looking to highlight and preserve many places where it hasn't been done in the past. My cousin went and studied abroad in Europe, and she took an American history class because I'm just curious to see how it's taught, across the pond.
Yeah.
And most of the American history and literature class that she took had to do with Native Americans. And she was like a little bit stunned because in the US that's not how it's taught at all.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting and really a wake-up call, she said, because she was like, I feel like I didn't know anything about my actual history and with the literature of our history because we just never studied that. So I really appreciate that your journal is taking the time to look at that and analyze and then preserve it. And how do you stay inspired with such a wide range of topics that you're interested in?
Oh, yeah, and that's a good question. So I do work on a lot. So, I've worked on fashion history, I've worked on 17th century French theatre, I've worked on sexuality, on cross-dressing, I've worked on Korean science fiction shows, I've worked on zombies, and I've worked on, 20th and 21st century French novels. So, it's a vast field. I think for me, one underlying principle is that, and that I try to promote in classes, is that the things we read and watch are not only for pleasure but also for instruction. That we can derive cultural benefit from them. We can learn from them. Even I like to stress that I'm always interested when a student doesn't like something. It's like, is this from your personal perspective you don't like it, or is it something about the work itself? Even things that we don't enjoy, we dislike, can actually teach us things. Sometimes it's like, I'm not going to read that author again, or whatever. So, with my range of interest, it's quite exciting for me, because when I go and see a movie or when I watch something, this could be a research opportunity as well. And often I've got files of things that I've watched that I start collecting, research articles that are related to it that I may do an article on. And sometimes it'll take a few years. I did an article published in 2023 on décolletage, so low-cut dresses for women, and the controversy they caused in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I'd been thinking about that for 10 years, and it was a perfect storm where I actually was able to present on it and write the article. So in a nutshell, it's kind of combining work and pleasure in one for me.
That definitely helps when you really love what you're doing, what you're reading, and what you're researching. And what advice do you have for students or even broader audience?
You're asking this of a professor, and we're not known for our brevity, but I think if it's in a nutshell, it would have to be read and watch things. Open yourself up to this. You will be a better and more informed person by listening to podcasts about history. I recommend the Rest is History British podcast. It's phenomenal. You'll be a better person for this knowledge. You will find that you can make more informed decisions, and you will be enriched. So just read. I use I use a safety razor. I do a wet shave every morning with a badger hair brush, and it takes a long time. It's a 20-minute process, to make the foam and to do everything. It's a ritual. We like rituals. But during those 20 minutes, I listen to an audiobook, and so in a month, it's like I squeeze 2 extra books in because of this. So yeah, whether you're on a bus or you're traveling in a car, listen to a podcast. At home, watch things and learn from them. So.
Well, Professor Scott, thank you so much for sharing your work, for your imagination, for your scholarship that reminds us that literature can be a window, a mirror, a door, and just the way that you continue to stay curious and invite others into your academic space. It's really inspiring, and I really appreciate your time and sitting down with me today. To our listeners, stay curious, stay speculative, make sure that you do some reading this week, and follow us on social media for more stories from KU's creative and scholarly frontier. We'll see you next time on the Crimson Chat.